He called the SAS tea-drinking amateurs. Then they destroyed him. This is how SAS created America's deadliest unit. Chapter 1. The Man Who Knew Everything. Upon arriving, Captain Charles Alvin Beckwith mumbled, "These guys don't even salute properly." Captain Charles Alvin Beckwith of the United States Army arrived at Hereford, England, in 1962, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything. He had reason for it. By any objective measure, Beckwith was exactly what a special operations soldier was supposed to look like. He had played college football at the University of Georgia well enough to be drafted by the Green Bay Packers, and had turned them down to serve his country, which told you something about the man's priorities from the start. He had completed Ranger School, one of the most physically demanding training programs in the United States Army. He had served in Korea. He had spent 2 years in Laos on Operation Hotfoot, running covert missions against the Pathet Lao in jungle so dense and hostile that most soldiers never saw it twice. He was decorated. He was respected. He was, by the standards of 1962, about as close to the ideal American Special Forces soldier as the Army could produce. He arrived at the home of 22 Special Air Service Regiment as an exchange officer, a formal program designed to build understanding between Allied special forces. The United States Army believed this was a reasonable idea. Beckwith believed, at the outset, that he would spend a year teaching the British a few things about how the world's finest military operated. What he found at Hereford was not what he expected. The regiment occupied a set of buildings that, by American standards, looked more like a working farm than a military installation. There was no parade ground energy. No spit-polished boots gleaming in formation. No officers standing ramrod straight while sergeants bellowed at men to present arms. The soldiers he encountered looked, to his Georgia eyes, like they hadn't been properly introduced to the concept of military bearing. They were lean and unhurried. They spoke to officers by first name. A sergeant might be in the middle of a sentence with a major when a trooper wandered in, pulled up a chair, and contributed to the conversation without asking permission, and nobody appeared to find this unusual. In the American Army, an officer's rank was visible, acknowledged, and respected in every interaction. The gap between a captain and a sergeant was a gap that existed in body language, in tone of voice, in the physical choreography of every encounter. You saluted. You said, "Sir." You waited to be addressed. The hierarchy was the institution, and the institution was the point. At Hereford, the hierarchy existed, but it operated on different terms. An SAS sergeant who had spent 3 years in Malayan jungle and survived things that would have ended most men's careers was not going to perform deference for a visiting American captain who had not yet proved himself in the face. Regiment's terms. Respect was not given with rank, it was given with performance, and Beckwith, whatever his record in the American Army, had not yet performed in their terms. He also noticed something else. The men looked, by the grooming standards he had been taught to associate with military excellence, like they needed a haircut. Their kit was stripped to the bone minimal, worn, chosen with an economy that seemed at odds with the American preference for having everything and having it properly issued. Where an American Special Forces soldier might pack comprehensively, planning for contingencies, the SAS men carried what they needed and nothing else. Sometimes what they needed was surprisingly little. Beckwith watched all of this and formed an assessment that was natural, understandable, and completely wrong. He thought he was looking at an undisciplined unit. He was looking at the opposite of an undisciplined unit. He was looking at men who had nothing left to prove to a parade ground. Chapter 2. The Jungle's Verdict. He only had a candle. The regiment was not based in Hereford at the time in any meaningful operational sense. It was based in Malaya, or more precisely, its men were rotating through the jungle of what would soon become Malaysia, conducting counterinsurgency operations against communist guerrilla forces in terrain that had been killing soldiers of every nation for decades. The Malayan jungle was not the jungle of imagination. It was not the verdant, photogenic canopy of a nature documentary. It was a dense, dripping, mercilessly hostile environment that operated on its own terms and made no concessions to human preference or military training. The temperature at ground level rarely varied. It was always hot, always wet, the air so saturated with moisture that clothing never fully dried, equipment rusted in days, and the human body became a breeding ground for every parasite, bacterium, and fungus that the jungle's ecosystem had spent millions of years perfecting. The vegetation was so thick in places that visibility extended perhaps 15 meters. Navigation required constant reference to compass and pace count because there were no landmarks, no roads, no features that a Western soldier could orient himself by. The noise was continuous and deceptive. The jungle made sounds that mimicked movement, that concealed movement, that made silence itself feel like a threat. The SAS had been operating in this environment for years. They had developed a methodology for jungle warfare that had no direct equivalent in the American military's doctrine. It was built around a single organizing principle. The jungle punished the man who brought more than he needed. Every kilogram of unnecessary weight was a kilogram that slowed you down, that drained your energy faster, that reduced your operational range. Every piece of kit that wasn't essential was a liability. The men who survived and operated effectively in Malaya were the men who had learned to strip their load to exactly what was needed, and nothing more, and who had developed the knowledge and skill to make that minimum sufficient. When Beckwith went into the jungle with a squadron, he packed like an American Special Forces soldier. John Lofty Wiseman, one of the SAS veterans who was present, later described what happened with the particular dry affection that the British reserve for truly instructive disasters. Beckwith went from 15 stone to 9 in a matter of days. The jungle hit him with the combination of diseases and parasites that it reserved for men who had not been inoculated against it through experience, malaria chief among them, combined with leptospirosis, a bacterial infection contracted from water contaminated by animal urine that attacked the kidneys and lungs with an efficiency that medical personnel in the field described as alarming. The symptoms arrived simultaneously: fever, headache, muscle pain so severe that movement became nearly impossible, vomiting, the particular grinding misery of a body that is losing its fight with its environment faster than it can recover. He was case-faced out. Lofty Wiseman, watching him go, had a thought that was entirely natural under the circumstances. Beckwith was leaving. His kit was staying. In the SAS, abandoned kit was available kit, and Lofty, who had spent enough time in the Malayan jungle to know the value of well-chosen equipment, went to see what the American had brought. He looked in the bag. There was a candle. Lofty, who had been prepared to discover something useful, a knife, perhaps, or a piece of equipment that would justify the weight Beckwith had been carrying, found a candle. One candle. In all the kit that the most decorated American Special Forces soldier the regiment had hosted, had packed for operations in the Malayan jungle, the most notable item was a candle. The SAS soldiers who heard the story were not cruel about it, in the way that soldiers sometimes are cruel about the failures of outsiders. They were quietly amused in the way that men are amused when something confirms a lesson they already know. The lesson was this: what you bring into the jungle reveals what you actually understand about the jungle. A man who brings a candle to the Malayan jungle has packed for a problem that does not exist in the Malayan jungle. He has brought comfort. He has brought the assumption that there will be evenings of a particular kind, requiring particular equipment. He has not yet understood that in the jungle, the problem is never the dark. The problem is the weight. Beckwith recovered. The diseases that had nearly killed him retreated under treatment, and within weeks he was functional again. And here is the thing about Charles Beckwith that matters for everything that follows. He went back in. He did not request reassignment. He did not decide that the exchange program had given him sufficient insight into British Special Forces methodology and that the rest of his year would be better spent at headquarters. He went back into the jungle, this time with a pack that had been stripped to what was actually needed, and he began the process of understanding what he had been looking at when he arrived at Hereford and seen men who he thought needed a haircut. Chapter 3. What he learned. Nobody gives you anything. You have to earn it. The SAS selection process was, in 1962, already the most brutal distillation of military capability in the Western world. It began on the Brecon Beacons, a range of Welsh mountains that would not intimidate anyone who had not tried to cross them in winter carrying a Bergen loaded to breaking point. The beacons are not technically demanding in the way that the Alps are technically demanding. They do not require climbing skill or specialist equipment. They simply require a man to keep moving, alone, across exposed and featureless moorland, in weather that is frequently determined to make stopping more attractive than continuing, for distances and with loads that increase progressively until the man either continues or does not. There is no encouragement. There is no instructor walking alongside offering motivational commentary. There is a route, a load, a time requirement, and a man who either meets the requirement or goes home. Most men went home. The attrition rate on SAS selection was not a carefully managed figure designed to produce a specific output. It was the natural consequence of a process that simply required what it required and made no accommodation for men who fell short. In any given intake, somewhere between 70 and 90% of candidates did not complete selection. They were not failures in any broader military sense. Many of them were decorated, experienced, capable soldiers who went on to distinguished careers elsewhere. They were simply not what the SAS needed. What the SAS needed, Beckwith was learning, was a very specific thing. Not the strongest man, not the most aggressive man, not the man most capable of physical performance when surrounded by his colleagues and competing for status. The jungle, the beacons, the long, brutal selection process, all of it was designed to find men who could perform alone. Men who, in the absence of anyone watching, in the absence of any external motivation, in conditions designed to make stopping feel rational, would keep going because stopping was not something they were constitutionally capable of. Beckwith had grown up in a military culture that emphasized collective performance. The unit was the organism. The group trained together, operated together, built cohesion through shared experience and mutual dependence. The American Special Forces model, the Green Berets, was built around the 12-man Operational Detachment Alpha, a team that trained together for months before deployment and operated as an integrated unit in the field. The assumption embedded in this model was that the team was more capable than the individual, that the collective intelligence and skill of 12 well-trained men exceeded what any single operator could provide. This was true, but the SAS had identified something that the team model missed. In certain environments, certain missions, certain operational realities, you could not send 12 men. You could send 4. Sometimes you could send 2, sometimes you could send 1. And the man you sent into a situation where he was alone, without the team around him, in conditions that the team model had not prepared him for, that man needed to be capable of operating effectively, regardless of whether anyone was watching, helping, or encouraging him. The SAS called this individual initiative. It was the capacity to make good decisions alone, under pressure, in ambiguous situations, without reference to a hierarchy or a doctrine. The training did not teach it directly. You could not teach it directly. You could only select for it by creating conditions in which the absence of it became visible and removing the men in whom it was absent. Beckwith watched men who looked, to the untrained eye, like they were being relaxed about military discipline. He began to understand that what he was seeing was something different. The absence of performative discipline, the saluting, the rigid bearing, the constant acknowledgement of rank, was not negligence. It was the result of a selection process that had already removed everyone who needed external discipline to function. The men left standing in the regiment after selection were men who did not need to be told to perform. Performance was what they were. He also watched the selection process itself, or rather, he watched the men who came to try and the men who stayed. He watched what happened to the ones who were clearly strong, clearly fit, clearly capable by conventional military measures, but who were not constituted the way the SAS required. They went home. The ones who stayed were not always the most impressive physical specimens. They were often quietly unremarkable in appearance, medium height, medium build, the kind of men who would not stand out in any crowd. What they had was not visible from the outside. It was a quality of self-possession that the selection process had been designed specifically to find. He wrote about it in his memoir, years later, in words that had the particular clarity of a man who had understood something important, late enough to know its value. What the regiment ended with, I thought, were men who enjoyed being alone, who could think and operate by themselves, men who were strong-minded and resolute. And then he wrote the line that would define the next 15 years of his professional life. Nobody gives you anything in the SAS. You have to earn it. He had arrived at Hereford in 1962 as a man who had earned everything the American Army had to give him. He was leaving, months later, as a man who understood that he had been measured against a different standard, and that the standard was better. The problem was that nobody in Washington wanted to hear about it. Chapter 4. 15 years of being told no. The Army doesn't need that kind of unit. Beckwith returned to the United States Army in 1963 with a report. It was detailed, specific, and argued from direct operational experience. He had watched the SAS operate in conditions that tested every assumption the American Army held about Special Forces methodology. He had seen what a unit built on genuine selection, not assignment, not the Green Beret model of training good soldiers to fill designated slots, but the brutal attrition-based process of finding the specific small percentage of soldiers who were constituted for independent operations in extremis could do that other units could not. He had watched men operate for weeks in the Malayan jungle with minimal resupply, maintaining operational effectiveness in conditions that would have degraded conventional units to uselessness in days. He had understood, with the particular force of a lesson learned from personal failure, what the difference was between a soldier trained to perform and a soldier selected because performance was innate. His conclusion was straightforward. The United States Army needed an equivalent unit, a force built not on the Green Beret model of unconventional warfare specialists and foreign internal defense, but on the SAS model of direct action capability, small teams, genuinely independent, capable of operating anywhere and against any target with no support and no extraction guarantee. Not a force of teachers, a force of doers. He presented his report to the Army's senior leadership. The response was polite and definitive. The Army did not need that kind of unit. Special forces were sufficient. The Green Berets were the American response to insurgency and unconventional warfare, and they were capable, well-trained, and deployable. The idea of creating a separate unit specifically modeled on a British regiment was unnecessary. The British had their methods. America had its own. Thank you, Captain Beckwith. Your service on the exchange program is noted, dismissed. He resubmitted the report. Same response. He found a different general. Resubmitted. Same response. He went to Vietnam, where he commanded Project Delta, a special forces unit that he built, using everything he had learned from the SAS, as a working demonstration of what he was arguing for. Delta was not the unit he wanted to create, it was a shadow of it, built from within the existing Green Beret structure without the independent selection process and the structural autonomy that he believed were essential. But it was the closest approximation he could build inside the constraints he was working within, and it worked. Delta conducted long-range reconnaissance missions that the conventional Army could not replicate. It found targets, assessed situations, and extracted information from environments where massed force was useless. Then, in early 1966, Beckwith took a .50 caliber round through the abdomen. The wound was, by every measure that military medicine applied, unsurvivable. A .50 caliber bullet is not a weapon designed to wound. It is a weapon designed to remove the possibility of survival, and when it passed through Beckwith's midsection, it produced the kind of damage that field surgeons triage as beyond intervention. He was listed as too badly wounded to treat in the field. He was going to die. He didn't. He recovered the second time in 3 years that his body had been told it was finished and had declined to agree, and returned to the Army with his abdomen rebuilt and his argument unchanged. America needed this unit. He had now survived 2 separate events that should have killed him, and neither of them had persuaded him that he was wrong about what he had seen at Hereford. The Army continued to find his proposal interesting but not urgent. He rewrote the training program for Ranger School. He overhauled the Green Beret Q course, importing everything he had understood from SAS selection about what the training process was actually supposed to find in a man. He commanded battalions in Vietnam. He rose through the ranks. And at every available opportunity, in briefings and memos and conversations with generals who had the authority to say yes, he kept making the same argument. The 1970s arrived. International terrorism was no longer a theoretical concern. Munich, Entebbe. The slow-motion catastrophe of hijackings and kidnappings and hostage situations being resolved or not resolved by improvised responses from military units that had not been trained for the specific operational requirements of counterterrorism and hostage rescue. The Army started to listen. In October of 1977, a German airliner, Lufthansa Flight 181, was hijacked by Palestinian terrorists and eventually flown to Mogadishu. The German Counter-Terrorism Unit, GSG-9, assaulted the aircraft. The operation took 7 minutes. All 86 hostages were rescued alive. The 4 hijackers were killed or wounded. 0 GSG-9 casualties. The assault had been opened with flashbang grenades thrown by two SAS advisors who had accompanied the German team, the same regiment that Beckwith had spent 15 years arguing America needed to replicate. The Pentagon convened meetings. The question of whether America had an equivalent capability became urgent in a way that Beckwith's reports had never quite made it urgent. The answer was no. The Green Berets were not that unit. Delta, the improvised version he had built in Vietnam, was gone. There was nothing. 15 years after he had walked out of Hereford with a report under his arm and the absolute conviction that he knew what America needed, they called Beckwith in and told him to build it. He had been saying this since 1963. It was now 1977. He was a colonel. He had survived a jungle that tried to kill him with disease and a war that tried to kill him with a bullet the size of a thumb. And he finally had his yes. He told them he needed 2 years and significant resources. He told them he was going to do it exactly the way the SAS had done it, selection first, training second, the process designed to find the men who were constituted for the work rather than assigning trained soldiers to a designated role. He told them this was not negotiable. They agreed. On the 19th of November, 1977, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta was activated at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It was built in every structural and philosophical detail that Beckwith could implement, on the model of the British Special Air Service. He had his unit, and within 2 years, he would watch it fail in the most public way possible. Chapter 5. Desert 1. 8 dead, 0 rescued. The copy failed, where the original had not. On the 4th of November, 1979, Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and staff hostage. The crisis that followed lasted 444 days and defined the Carter presidency. But the military dimension of it, the attempt to solve the problem by force rather than negotiation, lasted 1 night and ended in a burning desert in the early hours of the 25th of April, 1980. Operation Eagle Claw was, on paper, a sophisticated plan. Delta Force Beckwith's unit, built from the SAS template, trained by the SAS methodology, designed explicitly as America's answer to the regiment that had executed Operation Nimrod at the Iranian embassy in London with 17 minutes and 0 casualties, would be flown into Iran by helicopter, link up with a ground transportation element, enter Tehran under cover of darkness, assault the embassy compound, rescue the hostages, and extract by aircraft from a football stadium. The plan had redundancies built in. It had rehearsed the key elements. It had Beckwith himself as ground force commander, the man who had spent 15 years building precisely this capability for precisely this kind of mission. The helicopters were the problem. 8 RH-53 DC Stallion helicopters launched from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz in the Gulf of Oman. They were supposed to fly at low altitude through the Iranian desert to a staging area called Desert 1, rendezvous with the assault element already on the ground, refuel, and continue to a forward staging area near Tehran. The minimum number of helicopters required for the mission to proceed was 6. The helicopters flew into a haboob, a wall of suspended dust that reduced visibility to near 0, and that the mission planners had not accounted for with sufficient weight. 1 helicopter turned back with an instrument failure. 2 more suffered mechanical problems in the dust storm. When the remaining helicopters reached Desert 1, there were 5 functional aircraft, 1 below the minimum. The mission could not proceed. Beckwith stood on the packed desert sand at Desert 1, with his Delta operators assembled around him, the hostages still alive in Tehran less than 100 kilometers away, and made the call that no commander wants to make, and that only a certain kind of commander can make correctly. He recommended aborting the mission. The decision was approved. The abort order was given. What happened next was not part of any plan. In the confusion of the abort, an RH-53 helicopter, maneuvering in the dark, struck a C-130 transport aircraft on the ground. Both aircraft caught fire. The fire reached the C-130's ammunition and fuel. 8 American service members died in the explosion and the fire that followed. Their bodies were left in the Iranian desert when the surviving aircraft departed without completing the evacuation. The hostages remained in Tehran. Iran paraded the wreckage on international television. The Carter administration absorbed a blow from which it would not recover. and Charles Beckwith, who had spent 15 years building the American answer to the British Special Forces model that had never failed a comparable mission, gave a press conference in which he said, with the flat directness that had characterized every assessment of his career, "We got our asses kicked." 1980 was the year of both missions, not separated by decades, not different generations, not different eras of military technology. The same year, the same enemy. The same fundamental operational problem, a hostage situation inside an Iranian building requiring a special forces assault to resolve. In April, the SAS stood outside the Iranian embassy in Prince's Gate, London. Iranian terrorists had taken 26 hostages 6 days earlier. The British government, after exhausting every diplomatic avenue available, authorized the regiment to go in, 4 assault teams. Abseiling from the roof, entering through the windows, moving through the rooms of the building simultaneously to prevent the terrorists from executing hostages in response to the assault. The entire operation from first entry to last room cleared took 17 minutes. 5 of the 6 terrorists were killed. 1 was captured. All 26 hostages survived, with one exception who had been killed by the terrorists before the assault. The operation was filmed live by television cameras that had been covering the siege, and was watched by millions of people in real time. The copy had failed. The original had not. The unit that Beckwith had spent 15 years arguing America needed to replicate had just demonstrated, on live television, in front of the world, exactly what it was capable of in the same operational context where Delta Force had burned and died in the desert. Beckwith retired from the Army in 1981. He had built what he had set out to build. He had done it as close to the SAS model as the American military system would allow. The failure of Eagle Claw was not a failure of his unit's training or capability. The Delta operators on the ground at Desert 1 were ready, by every measure available, to execute the assault. The failure was in the joint operational planning and the helicopter logistics that were outside his control. But the image was indelible. America's version of the SAS, on its first real mission, had collapsed in a desert sandstorm. The original, in the same year, had spent 17 minutes and walked out with 26 people alive. Chapter 6. What the Candle Cost. The lesson was there the whole time. The story of Charles Beckwith and the SAS is, on one level, a story about a single man and a single institution. A decorated American soldier who arrived in England in 1962, was destroyed by a jungle and the exposure of his assumptions, and spent the rest of his professional life trying to transplant what he had seen to American soil. But it is also a story about something larger, about the gap between understanding a lesson and being permitted to apply it, about the institutional inertia that decides what it needs only after the cost of not having it has been paid in blood and humiliation. Beckwith understood what America needed in 1963. He was right. The events of 1980 confirmed it twice over, once in the desert, once on a London street, and confirmed something else as well. The gap between a unit built on genuine selection and the right philosophy, and a unit built on the right philosophy but without enough time to fully embed it, was measurable. Delta Force in 1980 was 2 years old. The SAS had been refining its selection and methodology for 3 decades. The difference in outcome was not inevitable. It was the difference between an institution that had had time to become what it needed to be and one that had not. What Beckwith had seen at Hereford, and what had taken him weeks in the jungle to understand properly, was not primarily a set of tactics or techniques. It was a philosophy of selection, the belief that the quality of the individual soldier was the fundamental determinant of operational capability, and that the right system for producing that quality was not training but selection. Not taking ordinary soldiers and making them better, but finding the specific men who were already constituted for the work and then training them. This sounds simple. It is not. It requires an institution to accept that most of its soldiers, however well trained, however dedicated, however capable within the conventional military framework, are not right for this specific purpose. It requires the willingness to fail the majority, not because the majority are poor soldiers, but because the minority the process is looking for is genuinely rare, and diluting the unit with men who are nearly right is more dangerous than leaving it smaller. An SAS patrol of 4 men who are exactly what the regiment requires is more capable than a platoon of 30 men who are mostly what the regiment requires. The American Army, in 1963, was not able to accept this. The institutional logic of the Army, ran in the opposite direction. More men, more resources, more firepower, more capability. The Green Beret model, which trained teams and deployed them as teams, fit within this logic. A unit that selected for individuals and operated in the smallest possible elements did not. It looked, to eyes trained by a different set of assumptions, like a small unit with light weapons and no doctrine for conventional operations, which is exactly what it was, and exactly what made it irreplaceable. The United States built Delta Force eventually. Beckwith got his yes. The unit he built became, in the decades after Eagle Claw, one of the most effective special operations forces in the world, the instrument of American power in operations that never appeared in official records, against targets that official policy did not acknowledge. It fought in Mogadishu in '93. It hunted in Afghanistan after 2001. It operated in Iraq in ways that the public still does not fully know. It became, over time, something worthy of the model it was based on. But it took 15 years to get permission to build it. And then it took another decade to become what Beckwith had seen at Hereford and understood in the Malayan jungle in the most direct way possible, by being destroyed by the environment and recovering, by looking into his own kit bag and understanding what a candle in the jungle actually meant. That candle matters. Not because it was funny, though Lofty Wiseman told the story with the particular warmth of a man who had liked Beckwith despite his initial assumptions, and who understood that the man's greatness was in what he did with the lesson rather than in never needing to learn it. It matters because of what it reveals. Beckwith arrived in Malaya with a candle. He packed it because, at some level, he was still preparing for a certain kind of environment, a structured environment, with evenings, with a base, with the assumption that darkness was a problem to be solved by light. He had not yet understood that in the jungle, darkness is never the problem. The jungle has its own light, its own rhythms, its own entirely different set of problems. The man who packs a candle for the jungle is the man who has not yet listened to what the jungle is actually telling him. The SAS had listened. The regiment's entire philosophy, the selection, the minimal kit, the individual initiative, the indifference to performative discipline was built from listening, from understanding, through decades of operational experience in environments that punished assumptions, exactly what was needed and nothing else. The informality that Beckwith had initially read as slackness was the product of men who had been through a process designed to strip away everything that was not essential, including the social performance of being a soldier. They were deadly serious. They simply didn't need to perform it for anyone. Beckwith went back into the jungle. He left his candle behind. He started listening, and everything that followed the 15 years of fighting a bureaucracy that wouldn't hear him, the creation of Delta Force, the failed mission in the desert, the unit that eventually became what it needed to be. Everything followed from the moment in a Malayan jungle in 1962, when a decorated American soldier understood that he had been measuring excellence by the wrong instrument. He had been looking for performance. The SAS were looking for something that didn't need an audience. Chapter 7. The regiment that made America's best. The copy never fully matched the original, but nothing else came close. In the years after Eagle Claw, the United States military underwent a fundamental restructuring of its special operations capability. The Holloway Commission, convened to examine what had gone wrong in the Iranian desert, produced recommendations that reshaped the American Special Operations community from the ground up. Joint Special Operations Command was created specifically to coordinate the kind of mission that Eagle Claw had attempted and failed multi-service, multi-unit operations requiring the kind of integrated planning that had been absent on the night the helicopters died. Beckwith himself contributed directly to these recommendations, providing the technical knowledge of someone who had built a unit and watched it fail in circumstances that were not the unit's fault. Delta Force continued. It trained, it improved, it absorbed lessons and developed capabilities. The men who went through its selection in the years after Eagle Claw were going through a process that Beckwith had built on the SAS model, and the process worked. It found the men it was looking for, in the proportions the regiment had always found them, 90% gone and 10% left standing, with something that no training could have put there. And across the Atlantic at Hereford, the regiment continued doing what it had always done. It is worth pausing on what that means. The SAS, by the time Beckwith arrived in 1962, had been in continuous operation since the Second World War, with the exception of a brief post-war disbandment that lasted less than 2 years. It had operated in Malaya for over a decade. It had operated in Borneo and Oman. It had developed, through operational experience across multiple theaters and against multiple kinds of adversary, a methodology that was the product not of theoretical planning but of finding out, repeatedly and at cost, what worked and what did not. The key word is continuity. The SAS selection process produced a specific kind of man, but it produced him into an institution that had decades of accumulated knowledge about how to use him. The culture of the regiment, the informality, the individual initiative, the expectation that a trooper would make good decisions alone in the dark without reference to doctrine was not designed. It had evolved, over 30 years of operational experience, as the natural expression of what the work required. When Beckwith built Delta Force in 1977, he could replicate the structure and the selection process. He could not replicate 30 years of institutional memory. This is what the candle actually cost. Not Beckwith's pride, not the months of recovery. The cost was time, the 15 years that the American Army spent telling him no, during which the SAS continued to accumulate the operational experience that is not teachable and not transferable, that exists only in the collective memory of an institution that has been doing the same thing continuously long enough for the doing to become second nature. By the time Delta was operational, the SAS had been doing this for 40 years. By the time Delta had a decade of experience of its own, the SAS had been doing it for 50. The gap never fully closed, not because Delta was inferior, but because you cannot shortcut institutional memory. The original always had the head start. What Beckwith gave America was not the SAS. He gave America the best approximation of the SAS that it was possible to build within the American military system, with American soldiers selected by a process derived from the original, in an institution that had to start its own accumulation of experience from zero. That approximation became, in time, one of the most capable special operations forces in the world. But the story of how it came to exist is the story of a man who arrived at Hereford in 1962 confident that he knew what excellence looked like, was taken to Malaya and shown what it actually looked like in terms he could not argue with, and spent the rest of his career trying to give his country what he had seen. He was right about what he saw. He was right about what America needed. He was right for 15 years of being told he was wrong. And in the end, he built it. He just had to leave the candle behind first. Chapter 8. The lesson that cannot be shortened. They were deadly serious. They simply didn't need to perform it for anyone. There is a particular kind of humility that is more difficult than any form of courage. Physical courage, the ability to keep moving toward a threat, to function under fire, to make decisions when the body's entire chemistry is screaming to stop, is something that can be trained. Not fully, not in everyone. But the military has a century of methodology for finding men who have it and developing it further. It is, in some ways, the easier problem. The harder problem is the humility that requires a man who has been excellent by the measures he has always been measured by to walk into a new environment, encounter men who look, by those same measures, like they are not his equal, and remain open to the possibility that he has been using the wrong measures. To not dismiss what he sees as inferior, but to sit with the discomfort of not yet understanding it, until understanding arrives. Beckwith had this quality. It was not visible at the start. He arrived at Hereford with the confident assessment of a man who had earned his credentials and knew their value. But when the jungle showed him what he was actually working with, he did not protect his self-assessment by concluding that the jungle was unfair, or that his sickness was bad luck, or that the SAS methodology was interesting, but not applicable to American conditions. He sat in his recovery and thought about a candle, and then he went back in. This matters because it is rare. Military cultures, all cultures, are efficient at producing men who can operate effectively within their own framework, and resistant to producing men who can recognize when the framework is wrong. Beckwith's army had taught him to be excellent, and it had taught him what excellence looked like, and both of those things were true. What it had not taught him, because it could not teach what it did not know, was that there was another way of being excellent that his framework did not measure and his training did not prepare him for. The SAS had found that other way. They had found it in the Malayan jungle in the 1950s and in Oman in the 60s, and in every subsequent theater where the regiment had been required to operate in conditions that conventional military frameworks could not accommodate. They had found it by failing, by losing men to environments that their assumptions had underestimated, by the particular education that comes from a jungle that does not care about your credentials and a selection process that does not care about your previous performance. Beckwith received the same education. He was lucky enough to receive it early, before the career investment in a wrong framework became too large to abandon. And he was constituted as the SAS selection process would have recognized to do something with it. What he did with it was spend 15 years fighting an institution that had not yet received the education, arguing for a capability that the institution would not understand until the absence of it produced a catastrophe that could not be explained away. He was patient with a patience that was not passive. He kept building approximations of what he wanted, kept demonstrating in Vietnam and in training that the methodology worked, kept finding generals who might listen longer than the last one had. He got there. The unit he built became what it needed to become, in the time available. Eagle Claw was a failure, but it was a failure that produced the structural reform JSOC, the Integrated Special Operations Command that made future operations possible. The men who went through Delta's selection in the years after Eagle Claw became the men who operated in Mogadishu, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in operations that have not been declassified and may never be. The institution grew its own memory. And none of it would have existed without a British regiment that looked, to a Georgia Ranger's eye in 1962, like they needed a haircut and a better understanding of military bearing. The SAS did not need to impress Beckwith. They did not need his assessment of their discipline, their kit, or their appearance. They had been through selection. They had been to Malaya. They had operated in conditions that would have made a parade ground seem like an irrelevant memory. They were, as Beckwith eventually understood and wrote in terms that carry the weight of a man who needed to be shown rather than told, deadly serious. They simply didn't need to perform it for anyone. The regiment that Beckwith had initially dismissed as undisciplined created, through one exchange officer's 18 months of education by humiliation, the unit that became the centerpiece of American counterterrorism capability for the next half-century. They did this by being exactly what they were, and waiting for a man capable of seeing it. He was. Who dares wins.